Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I am delighted to welcome you to today's preservation seminar series. Before you get started, I just want to remind everyone that today's presentation is a part of a 3-day series exploring historic preservation tools. Each day will be streamed live here on YouTube with the recording available upon completion of the program. In the course of the program, the audience is invited to pose questions of our speakers. These will be answered in the Q&A at the end of the program. To ask a question, simply use the live chat. Please note you may need to be logged in order to comment. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Charlotte Museum of History President and CEO, Adria Vogt, one of the hosts of today's program.
Hi, everyone. Thank you and welcome to day one of the Preservation Seminar Series. The museum is proud to partner with the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission for a series on preserving the historic built environment of our region. The museum exists to save and share the Charlotte region's history, helping create a better understanding of the past and inspiring dialogue about the future. Preserving the past, including the built environment, is essential in a healthy community. Historic buildings provide so many benefits to our city, including supporting economic development, providing affordable housing, enhancing our quality of life, and giving us a tangible connection to the past so that we can learn from it. We know it can sometimes be challenging to know where to begin with preservation, so we are excited to bring together a collection of experts to share their knowledge with you today and this week. My co-host today is no stranger to historic preservation himself. I'm delighted to introduce Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commissioner, Brian Clark.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As Adria said, I'm Brian Clark. I'm a commissioner on the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission, and we are the group that's responsible for dealing with individual historic properties. So we'll be hearing from both of the primary public groups commissions today, starting with the Historic Districts Commission, and then you'll hear from Jack Thompson and Stuart Gray of the Landmarks Commission. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, which is Christy Harpst. Christy is the program manager of the Charlotte Historic District Commission for the Charlotte Planning, Design, and Development Department. Prior to joining the Charlotte HDC staff in 2014, Christy served the Historic Preservation Regional Planner for the Middle Georgia Regional Commission. While in Georgia, she provided support to 32 communities with a broad range of planning projects, from comprehensive plans to downtown redevelopment initiatives, with an emphasis on historic preservation and assistance to Main Street communities. Christy earned a BA in Historic Preservation from Mary Washington College and a Master of Urban Planning with a certificate in Historic Preservation from Texas A&M. So, Christy.
Thanks, Brian. Okay, I'm going to start sharing my screen. Really appreciate the Museum of History for putting on this wonderful program. And today we're going to start talking about local government and preservation and what is community character. Specifically, how do you go about protecting community character, with a very brief introduction to historic preservation at the City of Charlotte and the tools we have for protection. Throughout this program, you will be hearing from various government and nonprofit agencies. Historic preservation in the United States, there are 3 basic levels: federal, state, and local. And then there are also 2 arms. You have the government and you have the nonprofit. And you see the Charlotte Museum of History is listed here as the nonprofit arm locally. But today we're focused on local government, and that will be the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmark Commission and the Charlotte Historic District Commission. But before we get into that, I want to talk a little bit about what is community character and how you define it. To many people, they think historic preservation and community character just means saving old buildings and the best of the best, which is great. Here you have Mount Vernon, and having museums where people can visit and learn about the history and culture of the United States and of the local community, like you have with the Alexander Homestead. And it is wonderful that these buildings are saved and protected cultural assets. But preservation and community character is so much more wide-ranging than these single structures and museum sites. Charleston is one of the first places in the United States where preservation began. And I hear so often from people comparing Charlotte to Charleston in terms of character and old buildings. And it's not an equitable comparison. Both places are unique with different stories and development. And there are distinctive character and diverse places that exist throughout the United States in all kinds of forms. For example, you have the Wigwam Motel in Holbrook, Arizona on Route 66. You have the 6-story tall Lucy the Elephant in Margate, New Jersey. You have the small 1940s ice cream stand in Fredericksburg, Virginia along Route 1. You have the grander Philip Johnson Glass House in Connecticut. And then you have these kind of quirky geodesic dome houses that were built in the 60s and 70s as an anti-mainstream countercultural statement. They were viewed as eco-friendly because they enclosed a maximum of space with minimal interior supports. And then more locally, you have the Excelsior Club on Beatties Ford Road, which hopefully most of you know was named as one of the top 10 most endangered places in America in 2019 by the National Trust. You also have the Salem School, the Jim Crow era Rosenwald School the Museum of History is working so hard to save and protect. And you have mid-century modern architecture. This is Hyde Park Estates in Charlotte. And of course, community character also means tree-lined streets, which is found throughout Charlotte. You also have the McCrory Heights neighborhood, which is home to men and women who led local Black institutions in the era of segregation, and they were key leaders nationally too in the civil rights movement. You also have the oldest residential structure in Dilworth. It doesn't look like much, but it is the last remaining Atherton Mill house, and it is being preserved by a preservation-minded owner. And a neat tidbit is that this house would have cost $400 to build in the 1890s, and now it's in one of the hottest neighborhoods in Charlotte, in Dilworth. You also have cemeteries like Old Settler cemeteries. And then you also have American small houses, which they aren't bungalows, they aren't ranches. You've probably seen them throughout Charlotte and haven't thought twice about them. But I wanted to share a little bit about them because they are so uniquely American, and they are found throughout Charlotte. And they're part of a larger housing phenomenon that was characterized by attention to design, construction, and marketing of these small houses across the country. And it's a uniquely American design. No other country in the world has ever focused on small single-family houses to a degree such as America did in the 1930s to the 1950s. It was a completely new type of housing, a completely new way of building and of financing these. And so these are neighborhoods, again, across Charlotte. They're in Sedgefield, Cotswold, Smallwood, Mary Oaks, and Wilmore. And it's just important to recognize these because they're not bungalows and they're not ranch houses. They're this other thing that people don't recognize them as important, but they are. So how do you define community character? Everyone in every place has a history, has environment, has assets. It doesn't have to be the grandest, oldest building to have character or to be important. You just need to take the time to evaluate, identify, and define it. Defining character is the first step in protecting and enhancing it. And one of the most well-known tools for protecting community character is historic preservation. And today's historic preservation is not that of the 1960s and 1970s, where people focused on protecting buildings based on architectural character, but we're okay with buildings that aren't distinctive or aren't interesting being razed and demolished. For example, in the 1980s, if it wasn't Victorian architecture, it wasn't important. These craftsman bungalows that everyone loves today, they were seen as disposable and they weren't important in the 1980s. But today, bungalows are, as we all know, a hot commodity, and even new construction across the region is incorporating architectural features of the craftsman style. So in the present day, The American small house and the ranch houses are what bungalows were in the 1980s. Locally, in local government, we have a sliding scale of preservation tools. I'm not going to talk about the one in the middle right now. We'll come back to that. But in Charlotte, you have the baseline zoning ordinance. It's a one-size-fits-all regulation. So if you are in a residential, you're an R4, R5, you have the same setbacks, the same requirements as everyone else. So you either have baseline zoning or you have really strong protections with the historic district overlay, which we get into the types of materials you can use, the accessory structure design, what kind of trees get planted and removed, how demolition occurs, what the building design looks like. It's all about how the building looks. And locally, there are two organizations that are often confused, and we often work together, but we are separate organizations. You have the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission, which you'll hear from in a few minutes, and they focus specifically on individual properties, sites, structures. And you have the Historic District Commission, which is my organization, and we focus on neighborhoods and larger areas. There is some overlap. The pictures shown below are those areas that are both landmarks and districts. So when a property is in both a local historic district, like Van Landingham is in the Plaza Midwood Local Historic District, it is also a historic landmark. So any changes to that property has to go through a design review process through both the Historic Landmarks Commission and the Historic District Commission. One distinct difference between us is that the Landmarks Commission reviews interior changes to most, not all, but most of their landmark buildings. And in districts, we only look at the exteriors. We have, right now, as of today, there are 6 local historic districts. Most of them are outside the 277 loop. It started with the 4th Ward in the 1970s. And Dilworth, as you can see, is the largest district. Hermitage Court at the bottom of the screen is our smallest district. It is a street within the larger Myers Park neighborhood. And most of the architecture within these districts, while they vary, they're from the late 1800s to the early 1900s up until about the 1940s. One thing that we're very excited about is welcoming, hopefully, a new district here very soon in Oakland Park. And this is off the Beatties Ford Road corridor. And it's a time capsule of the 1950s of the suburban architecture and planning that occurred then. There's smaller homes. They're about 1,200 square feet, 2 to 3 bedrooms, built in the 1955 to 1961 range. No two houses are alike, but you can see they have similar materials and features. And the neighborhood was created in the 1960s by Charles Urban. He was Charlotte's biggest developer at the time, and he was the 7th largest developer in the nation. And the neighborhood was also built specifically for African Americans, working class. You have your ministers, educators, warehousemen, janitors. And the neighborhood became concerned a few years ago as they have seen what's occurred around to other neighborhoods around them, and with investors starting to come into their neighborhood. And they were concerned that there would be a lot of demolition and redevelopment and that they would lose their neighborhood character. So they've been working with my office since October 2018 to create a local historic district to preserve that neighborhood character. And City Council is holding a public hearing on this rezoning on November 16th. Now, some of you are probably wondering, well, isn't Noda and Elizabeth and Myers Park, aren't those historic districts too? They are, but they're National Register. And so there are 2 different types of districts. National Register districts and landmarks are the National Register is America's official list of historic places. It identifies a place's history. There's no protection afforded to places on the National Register. So you can demolish the building, you can change it, you can do whatever you want to it if your building is on the National Register. Where the protection comes in is if you're with a local historic district. And you can see the overlap on the screen that Dilworth, Wesley Heights, and Hermitage Court are both the National Register districts, and local districts. And the benefits that these districts have is the benefit of some tax credits that if their projects meet certain qualifications in Dilworth and Wesley Heights and Hermitage Court, and they work with the state office, they can get tax credits for doing their projects. You will learn more about that in another session. The administration of local districts is done by staff. There are 3 of us and 12 Historic District Commission members. The Historic District Commission members are appointed by the mayor and city council, and they are neighborhood residents, business owners, architects, contractors, real estate agents, landscape architects. And they are the ones that help review projects and make determinations on if projects do or do not meet the design guidelines. Historic districts are only created when local residents ask that the quality and character of their neighborhood be protected. So it's not top down from the city. In all of these instances with 4th Ward to Wilmore, every neighborhood has requested that they become a historic district to help protect and regulate the growth and development of these neighborhoods. And I should also note that less than 1% of the city's developable parcels are under the purview of the HDC. So it's a really, really small area in Charlotte that's protected. So we have design guidelines, and that's what staff and the commission uses to help guide development. It's a manual really for property owners, staff, and the commissioners. There's graphics, maps, photos, and illustrations. This is our most recent updated version. It's from 2017. It's the result of input from residents on how they want to see their neighborhoods grow and develop. They want to retain their identity and charm, their tree-lined streets, their walkable front porch communities, the human scale buildings. Also pictured is just a brief snapshot of our annual report. And we do track all of our applications that we get on an annual basis to kind of see what the trends are with growth and development, where the projects are. Obviously, Dilworth has the most, as you can see, the most applications. They are our largest district, so that makes a lot of sense. The one thing I do want to point out about our design guidelines specifically, and this is the 3 biggest misconceptions about local districts in Charlotte. Now, local districts are different across the state, what they decide to regulate and not regulate, and they're different across the country. Some states allow for demolition to be completely prevented, but in North Carolina, the state said, no, we don't want to completely prevent demolition and redevelopment. So historic districts, you can only delay it for 365 days. And the point of the delay is to try and work with the property owner to try and find alternatives to demolition. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But we cannot prevent the demolition of historic structures in Charlotte. Neither us nor the Landmarks Commission can do that. We also, at the city, we don't regulate color. So if you want to paint your house polka dot or zebra stripes or 101 Dalmatians, you can do it. We don't care. Color is something that's so easy to change. It's not considered intrinsic to the building itself. The one exception is brick, because brick is a natural material with its own color variety. Painting brick is not allowed in the districts. We also don't regulate style. So the picture in the bottom corner, that's on the corner of Park Road and Euclid, I believe. It's new construction in the Dilworth Historic District. And you can see it's very contemporary. It doesn't look like a bungalow. It doesn't look like a Victorian, but it has the form and the roof shape that you do find throughout the district. So we will not dictate the style of new construction on vacant lots or the style of new construction where a building has been demolished. But if you select a style, say you select a craftsman bungalow, then all of those features need to fit. The last thing I want to talk about is this new tool that's under development. So you saw the slide earlier with the zoning ordinance and the local historic district overlay on either end. But there's a piece missing in the middle in the city's current zoning regulations, And what we're looking at including is called a neighborhood character district zoning overlay. So like historic districts, it's a zoning overlay. All the base zoning requirements remain the same. These are just another layer added on top of the base zoning. It's to encourage compatible infill with lot size and height. It's customizable by neighborhood. So if a neighborhood of ranch style houses, which are 18, 21 feet tall, and a house gets demolished and someone wants to come in and build a new house. Well, under the current zoning ordinance, the new house can be up to 40 feet tall. So 40 feet, building a 40-foot tall house next to these small ranch style houses starts to change the character of the neighborhood, which is fine, but not every neighborhood wants that. And so having a character overlay district allows the neighborhoods to self-select things that are important to them. Maybe it's height, maybe it's lot size, maybe it's setback, maybe it's parking, maybe it's all of these. It could be all, it could be one. And it's completely, again, self-selected by the neighborhood. And this is to help give residents another tool to help guide the development and redevelopment of their neighborhood in a very grassroots neighborhood-driven manner that doesn't have the restrictions as a historic district, but has a little more restrictions than the zoning ordinance. And this is just an example showing how local historic districts and character districts can manage change. Again, we can't prevent demolition in any district, but you can determine the size, height, and design of what goes back. Historic districts are absolutely not right for every neighborhood. And that's where maybe a character district comes in to help guide development in a more limited way. But the goal of these tools is to really help the neighborhoods and the property owners protect their investments, create a level of certainty that everyone is required to adhere to the design guidelines. It slows demolition, and it creates healthy incremental growth and development in the neighborhoods. Property owners know their investment is protected over time, and it also enables residents to stay in their homes and not feel pressured to leave. So protected areas have neighborhood diversity, as seen in this top picture in Thomas Avenue. This is the 1700 block of Thomas Avenue in Plaza Midwood. And you have a single family house next to a quadruplex or a fourplex, next to the Gray House, which is a duplex. Next to, you can barely see it, but the orange house is another single family house. And this is a built-in range of housing size, type, price point, rentals, ownership that exist in the neighborhoods that the historic districts help to maintain. Even though we don't get into use, we often find that regulating the design of what can go back does encourage the uses to remain varied. As opposed to Main Street and Cherry, which has seen these small houses or ranch houses been demolished and new 3-story houses with a built-up retaining wall be built in that area. Again, it's not a value judgment. Both have their own merits and both are unique in their own right. It's just these are tools given to the neighborhood to help them control how their neighborhood grows and develops. It's grassroots. It's not downward driven by the city. And it allows citizens to fully participate in the process, but it also requires consensus. So I just want to end with some photos of both historic buildings and some new buildings in our local districts. We have just such a richness and variety of architecture and craftsmanship in Charlotte's neighborhoods. Each neighborhood has its own flavor and character, and it's comprised of more than just the craftsman bungalow, like most people think. There are Victorians, there's the English Tudor, Queen Anne cottages, classical revival, colonial revival, American small house, the ranch house. And I just want to encourage you to look around and start noticing the character of the different parts of Charlotte the next time you're driving around town, and recognize that Charlotte's architecture and neighborhoods are just as special in its own way as the Charlestons and the New Orleans. and Charlotte's architecture is worthy of our pride and our preservation efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. Now, our next speakers are Jack Thompson and Stuart Gray from the Historic Landmarks Commission. So Jack has spent over 16 years in the field of preservation. In that time, he served as the director of the Historic Salisbury Foundation in Salisbury, North Carolina, and the executive director of the Preservation Society of Asheville and Buncombe County, where he worked to expand the capacity of the organization in education and on-the-ground preservation advocacy. Jack has worked to save nearly 100 buildings, primarily through the use of real estate transactions, protective covenants, and preservation easements. In his time as a project manager for Lee Morgan, Inc., a historic restoration general contractor in Charlotte, one of his projects included the Caldwell Barn reconstruction at the Charlotte Museum of History. In December of 2019, Jack was selected to succeed Dr. Dan Morrill as the executive director of the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission. And joining Jack is Stuart Gray. Stuart is the senior preservation planner for the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission. Stuart has been involved with historic preservation for over 20 years. He has a background in construction and hands-on restoration and has worked across the state as a consultant for National Register listings and local landmark designations. Stuart received his master's degree in historic preservation from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro and has been employed as a preservation planner by Mecklenburg County since 2006. So, Jack and Stuart.
Hey, Brian, thank you so much for the introductions. And Adria, thank you for bringing us in as a partner for today's seminar. And so I'm going to start off with kind of a high-level look at the work and composition of the Historic Landmarks Commission. And I will pitch it over to Stuart, who's going to take a deep dive into a notable property that has a long history in being recognized as historic and a lot of chapters in its eventual preservation and redevelopment. And so here we are. So here's our website. Most importantly, make a note of that because it's an incredibly important, valuable resource, has a lot of great information about the work we've done, that we continue to do, a real deep dive into the various properties. You can learn more about each of the landmarks by looking at the survey and research reports. There's mapping resources there and so on and so forth, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So who are we and what do we do and how do we do it? So the HLC, as we're known, we are a department of Mecklenburg County. We serve throughout the entire county, and we're a subdivision of that jurisdiction. The Historic Landmarks Commission is composed of 12 appointed citizen volunteers, and they're split up how they come to us. 6 are appointed by county commissioners, 4 are appointed by the Charlotte City Council, and then 2 more are appointed by the mayor of Charlotte. We are a staff of 3. We are small but mighty, and have a tremendous legacy in the work that's happened in Mecklenburg County over the last 47 years. If you pick up the phone and call the office, you're likely to hear from Elizabeth, who helps keeps everything in order in the office. Stuart works hard in the designation, survey, and design review arena, and my focus is primarily on education components and the administration of the revolving fund that we have and our projects work. So what do we do? First step of what we do is that we recommend the designation of individually significant properties as historic landmarks. So back in on May 21st of 1974, we designated these 4 properties. They were the first 4 designated in Mecklenburg County. And if you'll notice the dates on them, they are early properties for our area and primarily associated with wealthy or successful dead white men. Per the time period that we were in the mid 70s, there was a fervor around the bicentennial movement, a point in time when the historic preservation movement saw a rapid increase in interest and activities. And so you will, across the lands, see a lot of organizations, be it commissions, units of local government, or nonprofits established in the mid-70s, with some exception of earlier communities like Charleston, New Orleans, and so forth. So these are the first 4 that were designated by the HLC. The 3 across the top, Holly Bend, Latta Place, and Cedar Grove, are all in the northern part of Mecklenburg County. The Dinkins House is down on the southern side of the county. You can go to our website and take a deep dive into the history and the significance of each of these places. So just recently, in fact, July of this year, we designated these 3 sites, excuse me, the fabulous Arts and Crafts Bungalow Butler House, Derrida Gym from 1937, the Nevin School that has 2 periods of growth from 23 and 1940, and then the Ford Motor Company Assembly Plant of 1924. This property is what you'll hear much more about from Stuart later in our presentation today. And then just some of the more unique or interesting landmarks that we've designated throughout the years include properties on wheels. Tracking them down and making sure they're in good shape can be a fun exercise. But in the upper left-hand corner, you see the Charlotte New Look bus, which was in service from 1959 to 1992. Long-term residents or natives of the area will remember seeing these vehicles going up and down the road. The Excelsior Club has been discussed earlier in Christie's presentation. And luckily for this property, we are in the process of negotiating a permanent preservation easement for the facade of this building. And we'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a moment. And then other sites like the Reginald Armistice Hawkins House from 53 and 54, significant civil rights leader for our community. The house itself has come into its own vintage as a nice example of the mid-century modern movement. And of course, the steam-powered pumper for the fire department, and the beautiful Charlotte Coliseum from 1955. What else do? We buy and sell endangered historic landmarks through our revolving fund, and we place preservation covenants in the deeds when properties are sold. And so we work actively to acquire threatened historic landmarks. They must already be designated for us to be involved. And when we acquire those properties, quite often we will make investment in them in order to stabilize the property or arrest any progression of deterioration. We will often work on a preservation plan for the property that kind of lays out its path forward, making suggestions or identifying opportunities for adaptive reuse, often for commercial properties or income-producing properties. We'll put together a marketing plan, and eventually these properties will be permanently protected through a preservation covenant, often referred to as an easement. This is a nuance that's slightly different from what Christy mentioned earlier about the units of local government and their limitations on preventing demolition. So as she mentioned, the state of North Carolina requires us to enact, in the threat of a demolition, enact merely a 365-day demolition delay. However, once we are in the ownership position of a historic landmark, we can then put the covenants in place, which allows us to permanently protect the properties, which ultimately is the most powerful tool really in the toolbox of the preservationist. A recent example of our revolving fund work is the Charles Barnhart House from 1938. This is sandwiched between the Country Club, Charlotte Country Club area and Plaza Midwood. We designated the property in the fall of 2017. We purchased it just a few weeks later, and then we sold it roughly 2 years later, subject to the preservation covenants that are in place. As part of that process, we were also able to allow on a much larger lot some amount of additional new development, all the while protecting the historic resource for the future enjoyment of our community. Another project that we were involved with, and this was back in the early 2000s, is the Greer Ray House, built circa 1804. This is down south on Providence Road. Property was designated in October of '02, and we purchased land in November of '02. Mid-November, we picked the thing up and moved it probably half a mile in the middle of the night when the traffic wasn't as bad as normal. And eventually sold the property subject to preservation easements, preservation covenants. As you travel south, or as you travel on Providence Road, you will notice a road marker that we've put on the roadside there that tells a bit of the brief history of the Greer Ray House. Let's go right to the center of downtown. On South Tryon Street is the Latta Arcade. Many of you will be familiar with this property. The arcade is a building type that allows for the daylighting of the interior for basically what becomes storefronts, as you can see from this photo of the mezzanine area on the second floor, allowing all of the daylight to rush into the interior spaces. The building was built in 1914. It was designated in '78 and then had a slight amendment to the designation in '95. Instead of actually being in the ownership chain of this property, we simply received the donation of a conservation restriction or a preservation easement. It results in the same outcomes, that we can permanently prevent demolition of this important site right in the center of our downtown. And a current project of ours, this is the Albert Wallace Log House. It's in the eastern part of the county on Robinson Church Road. It was built in 1850, designated in 2 years ago in October of 2018. We purchased the property a year later, and we will be bringing this property, which includes 10.39 acres of the home site, pasture and woodlands, an 1,800 square foot log house with additions. You see the additions going to the left in the upper left-hand corner. There are multiple outbuildings and mature landscape. And again, this property will be sold subject to permanent preservation covenants. A wonderful place, a respite of 10 acres in a rapidly developing part of the county. What else do we do? We administer the design review over intended material alterations of historic landmarks. In some perspective on the volume of landmarks that are in Mecklenburg County relative to other programs throughout the state. As Brian mentioned, I come from Asheville. I was there for a decade. Buncombe County has roughly 40 designated local landmarks. Mecklenburg County has over 300. In the scale of inventory, we're the most successful local landmark program in the state. And it's something to be very proud of, not only for our staff, but the entire community with the number of properties that we've been able to preserve. But we do design review. As Christy mentioned, many of the properties include not only the exterior surfaces of the historic place, oftentimes the landscape of the historic place, and oftentimes the interior of the historic place. But every building, house, historic property is different. And so the designations are uniquely designed for each property to work towards the best level of protection for them. We utilize as our standards a tool known as the Secretary of the Interior Standards for the Treatment of Historic Properties. And again, as Christy mentioned, through our design review of landmarks, we can only prevent demolition for 365 days. On the screen is an example of what we have recently received as a submittal for a design review process for the Dowd House, which is in the western part of the city, and which will be getting some attention soon. And I put this up merely as what we considered as staff a really good example of the level of detail that we like to see when an applicant or a property owner makes a submittal for us to consider those potential material alterations. These are only 2 pages of probably a 10 or 12-page submittal. Does not always have to be this level of professional design work. We understand that every property owner is different and has different resources. We work really hard to consult with the property owners in advance of their applications so that we can get the best amount of material in hand based on the resources that the property owner has. We also work to educate the general public about the significance of our program and the landmarks that are involved. One of the key current educational resources that we have is our website. And again, if you haven't been there, I encourage you to go. It's the web address is at the top, landmarkscommission.org. Just get lost in the website. Under the historic properties menu will be all of our designated properties and the survey and research reports that are associated with them. There will also be under the same menu properties that are on our study list, which have under consideration but have not yet been designated. A list of surveys of larger geographic areas to try to get an understanding of the context of an area and the importance of areas or the individual properties within those areas. Sometimes the surveys are thematic, so we have a mid-century modernism survey for the city of Charlotte listed, listings of important African-American sites for the consideration of landmark designations, et cetera, et cetera. And there's our list of surveys there, or just the top of it. I think there's probably 30 or 40 individual survey documents of all different types of themes and geographies that you can explore. We also do a number of public speaking engagements, civic groups and neighborhoods. We are on the docket for Charlotte Rotary in the spring. We have a couple of neighborhood presentations that are coming up. So on. So if you'd like to hear from us in front of your neighborhood group, even in Zoom or this new virtual context, let us know. We'd be glad to set up a presentation to tell your folks more about what we do. A couple of other resources that I placed kind of in the educational component are the mapping resources that are available for historic properties. The image on the screen now is a GIS tool that has been developed by the state of North Carolina, and you can go to any county throughout the state. You can turn on and off various types of designations or research that's happened on various sites. What you see now, all of the blue dots, those are listings on the National Register of Historic Places. And as you remember, there's a distinction between, as you remember from Christie's presentation, there's a distinction between the National Register designation and the local designation. So all of the blue dots indicated on the screen are National Register properties. The purple are local landmarks. And I guess this is kind of bragging rights for the 47 years of work that we've been able to undertake here at the HLC. But if you look around our surrounding counties, even Rowan County with Salisbury, that's really well known for its preservation work, very few local landmarks. And again, this is meant to illustrate Mecklenburg County as a leader in this type of designation. This is a very powerful tool. You can zoom right in on your neighborhood. You can find the local landmarks or the National Register properties and other types of various designations. But we have our own tool here at Mecklenburg County, and it's called Polaris. The image that you see is Mecklenburg County. It's been zoomed in just ever so slightly, but you see the center inside the loop here of Charlotte. And all of the green indicators are various local landmarks. And so this is a layer. If you're familiar with the GIS process, this is a layer that you can turn on to identify various landmarks in your neighborhood or for the Sunday drive out in the county. And we are glad to help you understand how to use these tools. Give our office a call or shoot us an email. Our email addresses will be at the end of this presentation. So If you like what you've seen and you want to learn more about what we do or how to get involved, there's a couple of different opportunities available to you. We have 4 committees that actively engage the community. Our survey committee is really, you survey the environment to understand what's out there and what we need to work to preserve. They also work on the designation process. The projects committee works with the revolving fund in identifying properties where there's a level of intervention that we need to consider. Design review committee, again, reviews those material alterations. And our education committee has been slow to start during the pandemic, but the planning for that is underway as well. Also consider commission service as long as you're a county citizen. And at the minimum, you drive by the historic place and you've noticed it on your commute into town for the last 10 years, give us a call and let us know about it, and we can look into the potential of whether it rises to the level of a designation. With that, I'd like to hand it over to Mr. Stuart Gray to take a deep dive in the Charlotte Ford Motor Company assembly plant. Stuart?
Thank you, Jack. Like Jack mentioned, we're going to do a case study, and this is a case study of the Ford plant property. And I hope to do a couple things with the case study. I hope that the case study will demonstrate, one, how a property may possess historic significance, and two, how a preservation commission might identify historic resources. 3, how a preservation group might track a property, a historic property, work with the owner or any other process to help preserve the property. 4, how a property may become a designated historic landmark. And 5, what happens after designation. And so again, for our case study, and Jack brought it up earlier, is one of our most recent landmarks, designated, I believe, in July. But just because it's a recent landmark doesn't mean that it's new to the commission. Work on this property began before my employment with the county in 2006. And Jack, let's go to the next slide, please. So we're talking about the 1924 Ford Motor Company assembly plant. And for any property to be considered a landmark, it must possess historical significance. And this property, I'm sure we didn't do it credit with the last slide. We can click back to it if necessary, but this property is lousy with historical significance. And I hope this case study is going to demonstrate that. I was going to try to make this my portion about 10 minutes or so, but here we're looking at the slide about this property, and one of the main points that pops up almost immediately when you start looking deeply at the Ford plant is that it was designed by Albert Kahn, who was arguably the most important American industrial architect of the early 20th century. And having an Albert Kahn industrial building is almost in your town or in your community is almost the equivalent of having a Frank Lloyd Wright house in your community. And so for that narrow group of industrial architecture geeks, Albert Kahn is a superhero. And like I said, I was going to try to spend a little more than 10 minutes on the case study. We could easily talk about Albert Kahn and his work in Charlotte for half an hour, but we've got to keep moving. So the other, I said this thing was lousy with significance in a good way, is it also, the construction of the plant reflects the unprecedented development of Charlotte as an important industrial and commercial center early in the 20th century. Again, this thing is an artifact of this phenomenal growth that happened here in Charlotte, that transformed Charlotte from one of the cities in North Carolina to the largest city in North Carolina. It's a whole, we can do a half an hour on that, just with the Ford plant being the center of that discussion. And then lastly, for a property to have the significance to be a landmark, it needs to have some degree of integrity, meaning that what's there needs to be able to convey the historic sense of the property. And we've got this photo in the top right-hand corner of a portion of the Ford plant. That's the boiler house with the water tower in the background. And even from this distance with that small photograph, you can see that this property, at least that portion of it, has retained a remarkable degree of integrity. Jack, can we get the next slide, please? So in addition to this being the site of a very important site of the Ford Motor Company, and again, we won't go back to the earlier slide, but that first slide showed you the facade of the building built in the 1920s. It shut down during the Great Depression. That's part of the story here. It started as just a phenomenal industrial element for the city of Charlotte, but the Great Depression, as it did to so many other things, ended its history as a Ford plant. We pick up on the property again around 1941, the days before the U.S. involvement in World War II. The Ford plant, the former Ford plant, became what's called the Charlotte Quartermaster's Depot, which was a military army depot of material to support the army. And regardless, I'll go ahead and say it now before we get too deep into it. The Quartermaster Depot served a critical role in allowing the training and mobilization of the U.S. military during World War II. So I'll back up a little bit. The Ford plant, built in the 1920s, was a huge addition to the landscape, both physically and socially and economically. But even if the Ford plant wasn't there, we took that, and it's the center wider building there in that old grainy aerial photograph. Even if the Ford plant wasn't there, the story of this Quartermaster Depot is very compelling and has significance of its own. So we're already at a twofer on this property of having highly significant landscape changing developments at this property. And again, the Quartermaster Depot, we've got some great historic photos here of an early forklift moving that material around, and of the diesel electric engine, train engine that was operating on site to move material within this, what was essentially a massive, warehouse operation, again, to supply the training and mobilization of the military during World War II. And that lasted until 1949. It was critical throughout the war, and it stayed in operation for several years after the war. So let's go to the next slide, please. So its history and its association with the military didn't end there. The next significant thing that happened at the property is it was turned into a missile factory during the Cold War. That lasted from 1955 to 1965. And then the last significant period of its use from a historical perspective would be as the Gamma Goat manufacturing facility. The Gamma Goat was the Vietnam era equivalent of a Humvee, except it was also amphibious. It was a planned general purpose vehicle. And it was produced at this site from the late 60s into the early 70s. Jack, can you go to the next slide, please? And I think this is an important slide. This is a modern slide from Polaris that Jack referred to early. And what we end up with here in the present, after all this development of the site as the Ford plant, as the Quartermaster's plant, we've ended up with a 60-some acre site adjacent to Uptown Charlotte. And it contains over 1.3 million square feet of manufacturing and warehouse space. And that's 1.3 million square feet of historic buildings. So it is a fairly phenomenal piece of property from the historic preservation perspective. Jack, next slide, please. I'm going to do a few slides here. It's so much fun. I enjoyed seeing Christy's slides of the different architecture through Charlotte, and we'll dive into what makes this property architecturally significant. We talked about integrity. This is I think one of the funner aspects of this property. This is a raised and suspended bathroom in the Ford plant. Again, this reflects the innovation. It really reflects the genius of the architect. Why have the bathrooms and the manufacturing floor offices? Why would they use up that important space on the floor? If you raise all those uses up 10 feet, you can still have operations on the floor level, whether it's storage or maybe even there would have been supply lines or conveyor belts, et cetera, running under these uses. So it's not small, it's a large interior detail that's very arresting. And it just, again, reflects the innovation and technology that the Ford plant exhibits. Next slide, please. Here we are at the boiler house again, and integrity is one thing, condition is another. Integrity means, does it still convey the historic design and materials? But we can't ignore condition, and we're starting to see some condition issues here. It's pretty obvious that these massive and in my mind, aesthetically pleasing glass walls separated by metal members are starting to deteriorate, starting to rust. Luckily, it's a very robust, a very well-built plant. All of the buildings on the property are, and it's in no means endangered through neglect at this point. But again, I think this demonstrates the two things of integrity, but it can still be, a property can still be in poor condition. Jack, next slide. More of the boiler house, powerhouse. Again, I think this close-up slide really does convey a whole lot in terms of the inherent beauty of this industrial property and of its representation of that industrial age, early 20th century industrial age. Quite frankly, we could do a whole presentation on that last slide on the boiler house. And the building changed with the conversion of it to the quartermaster's depot. The site reflects the evolution of the property. And here we see, steam pipes running from the boiler house into the quartermaster's buildings, which are located to the north and to the east of the assembly plant. Next slide, please. This is a partial shot of the front of the assembly plant. If we were to go back to that first slide, which we won't, we'd see that it had large plate glass windows, for example, along most of the front and storefronts. It served both as an assembly plant, but also an advertisement for the product. Those over the development of the property became closed in with brick walls. And so this slide shows that despite the fact that we've had some alterations, the architecture is still apparent, is still impressive. And also it's a time to point out that as this property is rehabilitated, it's quite possible that some of it will be restored back to that 1924 appearance with glass windows. It'd be easy. Nothing has been done to the facade of this building that's not reversible. Next slide, please. Rear of the same building. And again, I would call those sawtooth clear stories on top, which are those shed roof features. They're covered with metal now, but the flat surface, the vertical surface, that is actually all window frame. And so when that metal was originally not there when it was exposed. Light flooded that building in a very dramatic and effective way. Jack, next slide, please. And here we are looking at the interior, just an overall interior shot of the assembly plant. And again, if we're looking up at that slanted roof section, the area to the right would have originally been all glass, and that could be restored during a renovation. Next slide, please. And now we're getting into the quartermaster buildings. And again, we've got 1.3 million square feet of space. The assembly plant's probably 240,000 square feet, but that still leaves over 1 million square feet of the warehouse architecture, and it's fascinating warehouse architecture developed when it was the Quartermaster's Depot in the 1940s. It alone has a lot of integrity and it has a lot of significance. Next slide, please. One more shot. What's amazing about these buildings, especially the ones to the east, are their length, 1,200 feet long, which I believe is almost a quarter of a mile. So they're phenomenal buildings. Next slide, please. So we looked at the building. I told you about the history of the building. And, you know, at some point over this 100-year history, and that point actually was around 2000, it became noticed. It became an object of the State Historic Preservation Office, an object of the attention of the State Historic Preservation Office and the Charlotte-Mecklenburg Historic Landmarks Commission. And the first time that the property was looked at as a historic resource was probably around 2000, because we've got a date on this survey, and it's not a survey is a very general term, meaning just to go out and try to identify the historic resources. And there was a survey co-sponsored by the Landmarks Commission and the State Historic Preservation Office for Charlotte-Mecklenburg County for industry, transportation, and education. And this survey work, completed in September 2001, which would tell me that it probably started in late 2000, it identified the Ford plant and the Quartermaster additions as potentially historically significant. Next slide, please. With that information in hand, the Landmarks Commission took a logical next step. They wanted to know, the survey was just that. It's fairly big picture, fairly brief assessment of the property. So the Landmarks Commission funded a report that was done by Ryan Sumner that was completed in July 2002. This is the cover photo, which I love, by the way, of the report, showing the Nike missile, showing the Quartermaster, showing the Model A Fords, and showing the assembly plant down in the bottom. This is the cover photo of the designation report for that property. The designation report does a fairly detailed history and assessment of a historic property. And that's done for any property that were to be designated as a landmark is going to require such a designation report. So this was the first concrete action the Landmarks Commission took in regard to this property. They approached the owner, which at that time it was being used as a Rite Aid drugstore warehouse, all 1.3 million square feet. And I believe it might have been their large East Coast distribution center. But Rite Aid operated out of this property in 2000, and they had for several decades before. And they were not interested in landmark designation or any preservation plan for their property at that point. But really what it did is it got it on the Landmarks Commission's radar. And also, again, the report made a very good case for its historical significance. Next slide, please. At some point in the mid-teens, it became apparent that Rite Aid was going to sell, or their successor company was going to sell the property. And again, we're talking about 60 acres on the edge of uptown Charlotte with 1.3 million square feet of historic buildings and folks called us because we made it really clear to anyone who would listen that the buildings were historic and there may be lucrative tax credits and tax advantages for saving, for rehabilitating that property. And we got calls, a range of calls. Some folks were calling to say, how quickly could we tear it down if we bought it? Are there any restraints on it? And it not being designated as a landmark, we didn't have any way to protect the property. We would try to take that opportunity to educate the potential buyer and say, yeah, but you might be leaving a whole lot of tax credit money on the table if you were to tear it down. Well, I'm sure I visited the site 3 or 4 times while it was still a warehouse, looking at it with potential buyers. And at some point in the teens, it was purchased by the current owner, which operates it as Camp North End. And they quickly made it clear that they were interested in the historic resources of the property. And it was used, this is a photo I took when it was not rehabilitated, but kind of a clean shell. And there was an event there where Harvey Gantt, former mayor and important architect of Charlotte, was speaking. And again, they're using that cool suspended bathroom as a PowerPoint projector screen there behind them. Next slide, please. Well, the way it evolved was that the current owners, after several consultations, and we let them know what was available, came back to us and said, we would like to have the original Ford Motor Company assembly plant designated as a historic landmark. And we embrace that. Of course, at the same time, I said, you've got another 1.1 million square feet of really important historic buildings out there. We'd love to help you preserve those. And their response was, this is what we want to do first. And it seemed very appropriate. So we worked with them to process it, and that necessitated an updated survey and research report. And again, this report that you're seeing here, this is the cover of it. It concentrated solely on the Ford Motor Company assembly plant. It did not look at the quartermaster's buildings like that earlier report did. Next slide, please. And we worked with them. The Landmarks Commission, I think it's fair to say, was enthusiastic about the potential for designating this property. It was a great report, and it culminated in its designation. This is a goofy slide showing the ordinance. It was adopted July 13th of this year. Next slide, please. So, and I could have stayed on that for a second, but with that ordinance, it became a designated landmark. Jack talked about the effect of it being a landmark. It's a legal, basically classification of a property as a landmark. It has certain protections and certain benefits, and also there's certain responsibilities or certain burdens on the property, such as design review. But this is an important slide, and it's a little bit out of place because this is out of that 60 acres. This is what we agreed to. This is what we worked with the owner to designate. They simply said, we just want to designate the Ford plant. And then it was up to staff and the Landmarks Commission to kind of craft something that met their need or their desire to designate only the plant, but to still give us a designated area that protected the building and the context. You can see it bumps out toward the top to catch the powerhouse or the boiler room and the water tower. And this is a massive building. I mean, we're looking at 10 acres there. So even if the area in front is 100 feet deep, the area in back is 120 feet deep, but even to call them slivers is not really fair. The sections on either side are relatively deep. I think the one to the south is maybe 80 feet from the designation line. So again, this was a compromise to not designate the entire property, but to designate an appropriate amount of property around the building. Jack, can you go to the next slide? So I'll wrap this up. That leaves us again with 1.1 million square feet of fascinating and beautiful historic building on that site. I do believe that the applicant or that the property owner is going to be coming back to us with portions, maybe most, maybe all of the additional properties, additional buildings for consideration for landmark status. I was talking to Jack before this symposium, and it's interesting that the property is almost 100 years old. The Ford property, almost 100 years old, with the building, the assembly plant opened in 1924. And so if you look at it, since we've been working on the designation and preservation of this property since around 2000, before Jack and I were even involved with Landmarks Commission, since the commission had been working on it, maybe even back into the early years of early part of 2000, for over 20% of the life of this property, or for the history of this property, someone has been working toward its preservation. And I think that's very, very notable. And I hope that it conveys that this whole thing conveys that preservation is generally a long-term endeavor and commitment, and it, in a way, it really starts again when it gets designated, because after that, next slide, please. After that, you need to manage the protection of the property. You need to protect it from state and other local government actions. You also need to review and approve any changes. And we've got just simple schematic rendering here of what they would like to see those quartermaster buildings become, which is sort of a mixed-use commercial property. And this is going to require, and again, this slide shows a portion of the roof gone. So there's going to be a lot of work to help them craft a rehabilitation for this property that's also going to preserve the historic character of the property. So again, I just want to convey it's a fun to see something that the commission's been working on for 20 years come to fruition. And again, I'm sure the commission's going to be working with them in the future decades to help preserve the property. That's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stuart. I just wanted to throw up the contact information for Stuart and myself through email. Shoot us a line. Here's our office number as well. You can give us a call, and we'll be glad to be of service. And again, Adria, Brian, thank you so much for inviting us to participate.
All right, thank you, Jack and Stuart. We've got a couple of minutes for questions, even though we're sort of run up against the time. So let me start with one for Christy. So Christy, what is the process for having a neighborhood designated as a local historic district? How does that begin? How long does it last? Those sorts of things.
Sure, that's a great question. It's very similar to designating a landmark. It's a two-part process. The first part is putting together that designation report that talks about the history and development of the neighborhood. There's a property by property survey that's done with photos of each house or building in the neighborhood and a brief history about the first owners, their occupations, any changes that have happened to it over the years. And all of that gets packaged and goes to the state for their review and input. And once we have that information back, the community can apply for a rezoning. And that's a completely separate process. But in order to apply for the rezoning, you have to have that designation report complete. And we also require a petition of 51% of the property owners in that neighborhood have to sign the petition requesting designation so that they have the support of the community is shown. And once we have those two things, it goes through the rezoning process. And it takes, Wilmore was our most recent one. They were designated in 2010. It took them about 10 years to be designated. Oakland Park took about a year and a half. So it all depends on the neighborhood and how organized they are and how quickly they decide they want to move forward.
Excellent, thank you. So from the Landmarks Commission point of view, I mean, how are most local landmark designations driven by the property owner, or by some third party, as with the, or a combination?
It's been my observation since coming on board that they come from all different sorts of directions. It can be very much a community motivated effort. It can be a property owner motive. We've identified kind of unilaterally within the survey committee of the HLC properties that we want to try to move forward with designation on. So it comes from a lot of different directions.
Right, and I'll just add that sometimes it can be generated from the community, and while the Landmarks Commission always strives to work with the property owner, the state law would allow, if a community really wants to see a property saved, and we've got a few examples of this, it can be designated whether the owner supports that designation or not.
Now, for both the Historic District Commission and the Historic Landmarks Commission, do the same design standards, the Secretary of Interior standards, govern design review?
Christy, you want to start with that, with your guidelines?
Sure. Yes. The Secretary of the Interior standards are included in our guidelines, and our guidelines are based on the Secretary of the Interior standards and just expand upon them. They're more detailed in terms of specific areas for new construction or for rehabilitating historic properties. It's just a more in-depth, deep dive into the Secretary of the Interior standards.
I'd say that what people might notice, however, is because the Districts Commission, they've got they have a context that they're trying to protect. And Christy, tell me, shut me up if I'm wrong.
Right.
In Wilmore, there's certain elements about the Wilmore neighborhood that they want to see preserved, and that's consistent across all of the projects, whether they are rehabilitation of an individual property or new construction. And I think the difference is with landmarks, we've got, and we don't exactly know how many landmarks we've got. We've got 350 or so, but Jack and I were talking about one property that involves 18 individual houses, so I won't go off into that too much. But we've got a great diversity of property types, of building types and property types and everything else. And so we have less of a guidelines or manual for when someone brings us a project. We really have to look at that property more individually and just judge it against the standards. So you may find us to be less consistent than the District Commission, but there's a pretty good reason for that.
All right, let me ask one more question. Jack, I think it was you that mentioned preservation covenants or preservation easements. So how do those work, and how does a homeowner go about putting one of those in place? And what's the benefit?
Great question. So it can happen two different ways. An easement is an interest in real property that's represented by the protection document itself that is donated by a property owner to a qualified organization like HLC or another nonprofit that's in a historic preservation business. And so for the purposes of the easement, the owner doesn't sell the property, doesn't put it on the market or anything like that. They simply go into a negotiation with us at HLC to lay out the important, significant parts, architecture, interior features of the property that should be permanently protected. And that's very much a dialogue that happens to create that document. And then once that's been refined and the owner's comfortable with it, they make that donation of the easement to the HLC. For the purposes of a preservation covenant, it functions the exact same way, but we place the covenant on the property when we actually own the property itself, and then we sell it to a new homeowner or to a new property owner, subject to those restrictions. I'm glad to talk with anybody in the community who owns a significant historic property about the notion of donating an easement to the HLC.
Thank you, Jack. think we're out of time on our questions and answers. So Adria?
Well, I just wanted to thank everyone in conclusion today for being a part of this preservation seminar series. I want to thank our speakers, Christy, Jack, and Stuart, and my co-host Brian with the Historic Landmarks Commission for joining us for this seminar. It's really great to hear the work that you have done and are doing. Thank you for this preservation work in our community. It's very important, and thank you for illuminating some of that work with our viewers today. This will be posted on our YouTube page, so you can check it out later if you missed any of this recording. And contact information will also be in that post, so you'll be able to see how to get in touch with everybody if you have further questions. We do have 2 more days of presentations as part of this seminar series. So tomorrow we will be discussing the role of nonprofit organizations in historic preservation with Preservation North Carolina and Preserve Mecklenburg. We're looking forward to joining them tomorrow. We have some other programs at the museum I hope you will check out. We're going to be doing another afternoon on the grounds, which is our open house environment. We do a digital tour on the grounds of Mecklenburg's oldest home site, the Hezekiah Alexander home site, 1774 Rock House that you can check out on the grounds this Saturday. We also have an Indigenous Peoples celebration in partnership with the Catawba Nation from November 9th through the 14th this year. That's going to be an online celebration. Hope you will join us and check that out as well. So thank you all for being here, and I hope to see you all tomorrow. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.